welcome everyone this evening, and a particularly warm welcome to our host chapters at the University of Pittsburgh, Katz School of Business, and Carnegie Mellon, Tepper School of Business. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Kate Ferguson. I'm one of the program officers for the Adam Smith Society. I'm very pleased to be the assigned program officer for our Pittsburgh chapters. So great to have all of you on this evening, as well as members of the network from all over the country, both our student and professional members this evening. I just want to do a quick plug to remind you sort of what the Adam Smith Society is first and foremost about. We are a chapter-based organization of free market-minded business leaders located at business schools around the country and with a national network of professionals in cities around the country and abroad. I would highly encourage you to join today if you're not already a member. We have wonderful programming. It's been moved to virtual throughout this sort of crazy time, but we look forward to the opportunity to get together again in person in cities and at business schools. So if you're not currently a member, I highly encourage you to go online and join. Or if you need additional information, you can reach out to myself or your chapter leader, and they'll tell you a little bit more about how to do so. So a few quick remarks about today's program. We will have about 30 minutes of discussion and debate with our two wonderful speakers and moderator this evening, followed by about 20 minutes of Q&A. We ask that all members submit their questions for our speakers via the chat function. And if you are selected, I will send you a direct message to let you know that your question has been selected, and our wonderful moderator will bring you on screen to either on screen or bring you out via voiceover to ask your questions of our esteemed speakers yourself. Tonight's event will be recorded, just as an FYI. It will be posted to our social media channels, so just make sure that, bear that in mind when you think about what questions you might ask. So lastly, I just want to take this time to introduce our moderator this evening. Eric Morath is a staff writer at the Wall Street Journal based in Washington, the Washington, D.C. Bureau. He oversees the publication's labor economics and policies coverage, fitting for tonight's event. He has appeared on CNN, CBS, and NPR, among other outlets, and he is a past winner of the Gerald Loeb Award for Business Journalism. Previously, Mr. Morath covered the Treasury and Commerce Departments, the Postal Service, and Bankruptcy News, and the Journal and other Dow Jones properties. Prior to joining the company in 2008, he covered the U.S. auto industry in Detroit. Mr. Morath graduated from Michigan State University, where he studied economics and journalism. He lives in Silver Springs, Maryland, with his wife and 3 children. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Eric.
Hi, thank you, Kate, for having me and for that kind introduction. And I'm really excited about the experts we have joining us tonight. So let me start by introducing them. We have Dr. Lee Ohanian. He's a distinguished professor of economics and director of the Ettinger Family Program in Macroeconomics at UCLA, where he has taught since 1999. He is also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and associate director of the Center for Advanced Study in Economic Efficiency at Arizona State University. He is an advisor to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and has previously advised the other Federal Reserve Bank, foreign central banks, and the National Science Foundation. His research, which focuses on economic crises, government policy, and inequality, has been published widely in peer-reviewed journals. He is co-director of the research initiative Macroeconomics Across Time and Space at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And we also have Dr. Daron Acemoglu. He is an institute professor at MIT and an elected fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Economic Society, the Econometric Society, and the Society of Labor Economists. His academic work covers a wide range of areas, including political economy, economic development, economic growth, inequality, labor economics, and the economics of networks. He is the author of 5 books, including Why Nations Fail, Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, and The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. Acemoglu has received numerous awards and prizes, including the Global Economy Prize in 2019. Thank you both for joining us tonight. Very much appreciate your presence.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Kate. Great to be here.
So let me just jump right in because we want to get to your expertise. I have several questions for you before we jump to hear from our audience. My first is, what is the appropriate role for the minimum wage in the free market economy? And should the minimum wage be a living wage, a family supporting wage, or really just a starting wage? Lee, why don't we start with you?
Okay, Eric, thanks so much. Thanks for having me on this panel, and it's a great, it's a lot of fun to share ideas with Daron, who's an old friend of mine. I always enjoy hearing his views. Okay, so in terms of this question about what's the role of the minimum wage, I like to put minimum wage policies within the context of broader labor market policies that affect individual workers. And from that perspective, I like to think about three policy objectives that government should be thinking about. One is to enhance compensation of workers, particularly those at the lower tail of the distribution, those workers who are not highly paid, who are struggling. Another objective that I think policy should be thinking about is to facilitate increased creation of new opportunities between a potential employer and a potential worker. And then a third objective would be to provide safeguards and protect the most vulnerable people within our workforce. So with those three policy ideas or objectives in place, I worry about the minimum wage from the standpoint that by setting a wage floor, we're essentially telling employers, how much they need to pay. And we're telling employees that some of whom who don't have the necessary human capital, that they may not be able to find a job. They'll have a very difficult time finding a job. So one of those three objectives, creating new opportunities, I worry about the minimum wage's influence on that policy objective. And for interrelated reasons, I worry about the minimum wage's effect on the most vulnerable workers, who tend to be those with the lowest amounts of human capital, including recent immigrants and young people. And then when we think about the other objective, which is facilitate policies that facilitate increasing compensation, I think, in my perspective, there's probably better ways to do that, and policies that can make progress on all three of those events. And today we're here with a large group of people who are interested in this issue. And I think until we confront what I'll call the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that 800-pound gorilla is an education system that both Daron and I are part of, but an education system that, quite frankly, is failing a lot of our children, that's failed adults in this country at the K through 12 level, at the community college level. I think there's a lot of reforms we can do to increase the efficiency and productivity of our education system. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about the minimum wage, we're talking about people who simply haven't been able to accumulate or create the necessary human capital to compete and secure for reasonably high-paying jobs. And until we confront that, we're going to continue to be having discussions like this year after year.
All right, thank you. That's a great way to kick us off. What is your response, Daron?
So I think in a world in which the labor market is competitive, Lee's answer is perfect. By a competitive labor market, essentially, we mean an environment in which employees are indifferent between taking any job and going back and looking for another job right away. And employers at the margin don't make rents, meaning at the margin supernormal profits from the last worker or the last hour of work that they hire. The competitive benchmark is a pretty good one for certain goods and services. So we wouldn't want to put a floor price for apples, and not that we care about the income distribution among apples either. So not that relevant for some of the concerns that Lee was raising, but from an efficiency point of view, that would certainly not enhance the functioning of the market for apples. But there is, I think, quite a lot of evidence that labor markets are not competitive. No employee would leave their job if they were paid 5 cents less than they are being paid at the moment by their current employer. If it was a competitive market, the moment I pay you 2 cents or 5 cents less, you would say, well, I can take my next best job, which is exactly at the same price. And most employers, for a variety of reasons, make rents from the employment relationship, and that's certainly increasingly true for many large employers. And there are also a variety of social concerns and interactions that exist in the labor market. Reputation, sort of goodwill or gift exchange between employers and employees, which apply differentially across different jobs and different employers. So all of these raise the possibility that labor market prices aren't exactly at the right level, and certainly for workers that may not have protection that comes from bargaining power or a rich set of options. In such situations, it is an empirical matter whether the three objectives that Lee mentioned would all be enhanced by a higher but moderate minimum wage. So the most important concern that Lee raised, which I wholeheartedly worry about, is that by putting a higher minimum wage, you're going to hurt exactly the most vulnerable workers, because those are the ones that are going to be priced out of the market. But if it is a rent-driven market, it will be exactly those most vulnerable workers that are paid quite a bit below their outside options or their marginal productivity, because their outside options are low. And then in that case, minimum wages can actually enhance both opportunities and distribution. And for that reason, markets with rents and competitive markets make quite different predictions about the effects of the minimum wage. In competitive markets, it's fairly unambiguous. Higher minimum wages should lead to disemployment, especially for the most affected workers. In markets with rents, that may happen, but depending on the form of rents, especially if it's bargaining or monopsony power, or there is excessive power of employers relative to certain groups of workers, higher minimum wages may just increase wages without creating disemployment, might even increase employment. And my read of the empirical evidence is that it's much closer to the latter than the former, which again makes me think that a market without rents is not the right frame for thinking about these issues. And if that's the case, I think we can enhance both distribution and efficiency with moderate minimum wages. Now, the question then becomes, is a federal minimum wage going up to $15 moderate or not? And I'm sure we're going to discuss that. But in the abstract, a minimum wage of 0 is not the right level in a labor market like that.
Yeah, and I want to jump in and talk specifically about the proposal that President Biden has put on the table of a $15 minimum wage in the next few years. The Congressional Budget Office found that raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour could deliver raises for 27 million workers, but they also found that it could cost 1.4 million workers their jobs. So, Daron, to what degree is that level of job loss, acceptable when considering, how many people potentially could benefit from a policy? And maybe
so if the CBO numbers were correct, that would give me pause.
Okay.
I don't believe the CBO numbers are correct. There is now a huge literature on the minimum wage, and a handful of studies find significant negative effects from the minimum wage. And a large number of them find 0 or even small, very small, tiny positive effects. My own read of the literature, some of these papers I teach, is that the ones that find negative effects in the US are not particularly reliable. So my read is that the vast majority of the reliable, credible estimates in the US are bunched around zero. CBO, on the other hand, takes an average of a number of estimates, but samples a few of the zeros and puts a lot of weight on the negative ones, and hence it ends up with a negative disemployment effect, or negative employment effect. And as a result, when they run the model that they have with these parameters, they end up with a 1.4 million job loss. But I don't think that's the right conclusion given the empirical evidence. Now, there are things that we can discuss about the empirical evidence. Many of the estimates are for minimum wage levels that are much less than $15 an hour. So we could worry about whether they are representative of what $15 an hour is going to give us. But that discussion is completely orthogonal to CBO's way of doing things, which just doesn't use the right numbers.
Lee, what do you think? What do you think of the CBO report, and should we be concerned? How do we balance job loss versus raises?
Sure. Let me just take one moment to make a couple of comments about some of Daron's very interesting remarks before that.
Sure.
And Daron hit the nail on the head by saying formulating the right type of policies to help individuals in the labor market really depends on your overall vision of how competitive our labor market. And when I say our labor market, I mean there's tens of thousands of labor markets across the vast land we call the United States and across many different occupations. But when we think about policies, it really is about our vision of how efficient that market works. Daron has a little bit more of a pessimistic vision of the efficiency of our labor markets than I do. And it may be a little bit of me calling the glass X% full and Daron calling it 1 minus X% empty. But some of the statistics that lead me to believe that the market is working really, from my perspective, quite well, is BLS data from a survey called JOLTS. And JOLTS within the BLS is called the Job Opening and Labor Turnover Survey. And it's relatively new. And it's a survey that has been very eye-opening because it doesn't show us just how much employment grows at the aggregate every month or every year, but it tells us what happens within industries and across jobs. And the numbers, I think, I find the numbers remarkable. So in a normal year, which I'll say take 2018 or 2019 before the pandemic, Joel shows there's about 85 million job openings per year and about 70 million hires per year. In an economy at the aggregate level, where there's about 2 million additional job growth. So that just shows us that workers are moving from one job to another as circumstances change, and there's fluctuations in supply and demand across various industries, and there's technological change. But with 70 million hires, and also there are a lot of quits, about a third of the workforce turns over every year as people quit jobs. So that tells me that there's a lot of dynamism in the American labor market. And the statistics I'm citing are much higher. There's more fluidity in the labor market here than in Europe, where, for example, that type of dynamism is only 50% to 30% of what we have here. And then from the standpoint of the CBO, the challenge we have is that there's a lot of different studies about the minimum wage. Daron has a certain reading of that literature. I've read a lot of those. Dave Newmark at UC Irvine, who's been following this for close to 30 years, has a new paper where he tries to just not debate the papers, but rather look at findings. And there's elasticity estimates that he cites as being negative and significant about half the time. But I look at it, I essentially turn the coin over, which is to say, not to say that job loss isn't important. And I think both Daron and I agree that 1.4 million job loss would be, well, I won't put words in his mouth, but I would say that would be unacceptable. because we shouldn't be picking between winners and losers. That is, you get to keep your job and you're going to have a raise, but sorry, this other person is going to lose their job because we can't keep them on the payroll. But I look at really the cost of minimum wage as more in terms of foregone opportunities. And I know we're going to get into different demographic groups later. But when I look at minimum wages, I look at unemployment rates for those who don't have high levels of human capital, teens. And in particular, I was looking at Black teen unemployment rates. And the average for the last 50 years has been 34.5%. So I view those people as really struggling to find a job. And the interpretation I give of that is because they're being priced out of the labor market. And interestingly, before the minimum wage became, not to debate the level at this stage, but back in the 1950s, when the minimum wage was really just not an issue, Black teen unemployment rates, white teen unemployment rates were about the same at about 8%. So yeah, I don't know what the number will be in terms of job loss. If we go to $15 an hour, it's just so hard to interpret because we haven't done experiments at the economy-wide level. And we know very little about the long-run consequences of what happens when the minimum wage goes up. Isaac Sorkin at Stanford has done some interesting work on that, maybe we can get into. But I think not enough attention is paid to the matches and the creation of opportunities that might get prevented, particularly for those who I view as being most vulnerable.
And you know, speaking about some of those groups that are most affected, Daron, could you speak to that? Who could benefit and who might be impacted negatively from doubling the minimum wage from 7 to 25 to 15? And I do want to get you on the record if you could add, you know, do you view 15 as sort of a moderate acceptable level, or is that on the high end of what would work?
Well, 15 would be at the higher end of the range.
Okay.
And but you know, quite importantly, you know, the current plan is not going to 15 right away, so it's a gradual increase. And we'll get into this later as well. I think 15 is completely fine because of where it falls in the distribution in New York City or Boston or LA. The question is, you know, whether in Mississippi or Louisiana, 15 is going to be very damaging, and there are some valid questions there. But again, I hasten to add, the evidence we have is not at anything like 15. It's real minimum wage around $7, $8, $10 over the last 40 years. You know, the US real minimum wage in today's numbers would be about $10 an hour in the 1970s. And then it's fallen about a third in real terms because it increased, but not as much as inflation. So that evidence, the evidence coming from that sort of variation, says that in contrast to the fear that Lee mentioned, the effects are very similar across different demographic groups, conditional on wage. So if I look at a low wage Black worker versus a low-wage white worker, the disemployment effects are not different, or a low-wage young worker versus low-wage old worker. Obviously, the impact both in terms of higher wages and in terms of disemployment effects for the handful of studies that do find some disemployment effects, the impact is on workers with lower earnings. But there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of rationing out of a particular group. And Lee also raises another important issue. One could worry about long-term versus short-term effects. So far, the evidence, again, for the moderate levels of minimum wages doesn't quite support that the long-term effects are very different than the short-term effects. And we know that because, you know, groups in the part of the distribution that are impacted by the minimum wage versus not just tend to be swept up and stay there. So what that means is that, you know, if the distribution of wages without the minimum had a bunch of people just below the minimum, then once you put the minimum wage, those people just get swept over the minimum wage and stay there. Those jobs then don't later then disappear. But we do know, exactly going to Lee's point, that once you have significantly higher minimum wages, firms might be tempted to go to automation or other more sort of drastic measures that could have negative effects. And again, whether $15 an hour will trigger those sorts of effects in the US today, that's an open question.
Lee, I want you to respond to that, but I want to slip in another question of, in your view, do you think the minimum wage is something that should be set at the federal level, or if it should it be set elsewhere, like the state or the local level? And in addition to adding any additional comments you have on the demographic groups that would be impacted by this policy.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a danger in a top-down high federal minimum wage, because there is so much variation across labor markets in the country. So Daron mentioned, Mississippi, and that's one that I was looking at yesterday. So the median, before the pandemic, the median wage among hourly workers in Mississippi was right at about $15 an hour. I mean, so half of workers are making $15 an hour or less. Compare that to San Francisco. San Francisco has a median wage of $41 an hour. So 15 is really meaningless in San Francisco. 15 can be, just big potatoes in Mississippi. So that's something that independent of whether we have a minimum wage or how we do it, there's going to be areas of the country that could be very, very affected very much more than others. And then in terms of demographic groups, I think we know a lot about who's going to be affected. It's those with relatively low education levels. So for example, those with bachelor's degrees right now earn about $1,200 a week when we measure that for normal hours. With no high school completion, we're down to $520 per week. So again, those would be the vulnerable people. One thing I'd like to point out is that we live in we're very lucky to live in the United States. It's a dynamic, growing economy. There still is a lot of fluidity. Nearly half of minimum wage workers are in the 16 to 24 age range. And I looked at data and tried to track, I couldn't track individuals, but I tracked demographic age groups over time. And those young folks who are earning relatively little at the age of 17 or 18, you track that cohort over time. When they get to about 30 years old, they're earning almost 60% more. So I still see the U.S. labor market as one in which there's a lot of opportunity. We have a lot of job creation, particularly compared to other countries. And we see attractive life cycle wage profiles in which young people don't earn a whole lot when they're starting out, but 10 years later, so they're earning about 60% more. So it's important to keep in mind that those earning the minimum wage today are probably not going to be those earning the minimum wage 5 years from now.
Daron, can you speak to what role there should be for the federal government in minimum wage policy? And one of the things I think about when looking at this is that while San Francisco or Washington, D.C. have raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour or more, just across the river from here in Virginia, still $7.25, or a big city like Philadelphia, would still fall at $7.25. Does that influence whether the federal government needs to play a role?
So, as you can see, there's a lot of agreement between me and Lee. I guess one area of disagreement is, how much rents versus competitive fluidity matters. But there's another, I guess, area of disagreement, which I think colors our somewhat different interpretations. And I think the US labor market seriously failing over the last 40 years. That, the picture that Lee painted, I think is a perfect representation of what the data show for 1960s, early 70s, 1950s. Very dynamic, very fluid, and with a lot of wage growth and employment growth. The US labor market over the last 40 years doesn't look like that. it's much more of a two-tier society. If you are a postgraduate worker or worker with specialized skills, your earnings have continued to increase. But if you look at median wages, they have essentially stagnated. They have increased by single digits, depending on how you measure it, since 1980 to today, whereas productivity more than doubled. The real wages of young, non-college workers have fallen by as much as 30 to 35% in real terms. And even though there is a lot of job churn, and Lee is absolutely right, that has continued to be the case, many more workers have dropped out of the labor force. So if you look at prime age men, for example, in the US, their labor force participation rate was around 95%, or only 5% or so of them were out of the labor force. Today, that number is close to 15%. So the labor market is not doing very well, and it has been accompanied with other things that Lee also himself emphasized: educational services, health services, other types of things that we expect from a prosperous society as part of the package. You know, shared prosperity, decent wage growth, career building jobs, as well as public services. So many in the US are not enjoying these things. And I think it isn't realistic, in my opinion, to expect that local governments are going to step up and meet those challenges. We haven't seen the local governments step up and meet the education challenge, or the health challenge, or the law enforcement challenge. So the federal government may need to play an important role in such situations. This is what motivates my view that as a second best, the federal government coming in and imposing a federal minimum wage is acceptable. If we had an ideal society in which local governments were taking initiative, absolutely. I am with Lee and with you, I think, Eric, from the way that you asked the question. I would prefer the local minimum wage to be catered to the specific needs, that Louisiana should have a different minimum wage than Massachusetts. As a rough guide, it's not perfect, but as a rough guide, the same ratio of the median wage. So the median wage in Louisiana is, 60% less than the one in Massachusetts. So therefore, their real minimum wage should be lower as well. But if the federal minimum wage does not increase, Louisiana is not going to introduce, Mississippi is not going to introduce a real minimum wage. And therefore, that's going to continue to contribute to the two-tier society now in the geographic dimensions, that a lot of workers without any protection, many of them immigrants, many of them minorities, many of them low education, that live in the states that do not provide those sort of protections are going to fall even behind. So I think it is the most existential challenge that the US economy faces, is how do we prevent this two-tiered society from deepening and going back to something that much more resembles shared prosperity. I'm completely with Lee. Other tools should be used as well: education, earned income tax credit, job subsidies, cut off payroll taxes. I think there are a lot of other arrows in our quiver that we should be using. But I think minimum wages in a labor market that is not perfectly competitive are going to be part of that portfolio as well.
All right, I want to get to some of the great questions we have, but I want to ask you one quick lightning round question of, if you were elected president, what would be the minimum wage you'd advocate for at the State of the Union address? Daron, what do you say?
I would have probably gone for something like 12, and then see what that does, and then adjust it upwards. But again, I think it's politics. First of all, 15 was a promise. That's the bad part of politics, that it became a lightning sort of sort of a focal point for the politics, but also the good side of politics. I think the Biden administration realizes that they can pass this only once. So doing 12 and then experiment and see if 12 works and then increase it to 13 and then increase it to 14 is not going to work easily. And they're forced to go for something that gradually increases to 15 without waiting for the evidence that whether 12, 13 works and is very costly or not, especially in places such as Louisiana and Mississippi.
All right, and Lee, before we jump to the questions, what would be your level, or is it 0?
Okay, if you can just give me, I'd love to respond to a couple of statements Daron made before that, and I promise to give you a number. But I think really what's relevant for the discussion and things like, if you're going to pick a federal minimum wage, what number do you go with, including political considerations? I think at the end of the day, we have to be realistic and ask, okay, what businesses are paying the minimum wage? And do they have satisfactory margins that they can pay workers more and not really have allocational effects on how many workers they hire? And low wages are really concentrated in service sector jobs, including restaurants, where about 1.3 million people before the pandemic worked below the minimum wage. So compensation was largely things like gratuities and tips. Do those businesses have the margins? I think Daron's suggesting that they have the margins to pay. This is going to be an accounting profit statement, but fast food pre-tax margins are 6 to 8%. Full service restaurants are about 5%. There's not an awful lot of wiggle room there. Daron is, I think, kind of blaming the U.S. labor market. I see it as the education market, the education industry. When I look at the economy today, I think competitive forces are even stronger now than they were back in the day. There was tons of monopoly in the U.S. economy back in the 60s and 70s when U.S. Steel faced no competition, GM faced no competition. We have an incredibly competitive economy today. I don't see the rents being there that can support numbers that some people are talking about in terms of minimum wages. And one important thing for listeners to keep in mind is that wages and compensation are different. In the 1960s, the value of non-wage benefits, including health plans, was about 5% of total compensation. Today, it's over 30%, partly because healthcare has become so expensive. And then again, who pays minimum wages? A lot of it's being paid by small businesses. Big businesses tend to pay high wages. They're not going to be impacted much by this. Small businesses are having a hard time getting by, and those are the ones paying a lot of the minimum wages. So that said, if I were president, I would say politics is going to take the front stage, and I would try to think that $10 an hour, not that I think that's the right economic number, but I think that would be hopefully a politically acceptable number. And Daron, I appreciate all your comments. Always fun to share ideas, and look forward to the questions.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to call on some folks for questions. Please be brief in your question. Make it a question, not a mini speech, and unmute yourself once you're called upon so that we can hear you. I'd like to start with Naftali Burakovsky. Could you please give us your question, Naftali?
Well, thank you, Eric. So my question, can one of you mute? Yeah, sorry. So my question has to do with what your thoughts are about potential alternatives to the minimum wage. You mentioned briefly about earned income tax credits, as well as possibly universal basic income, but as a way of solving that living wage issue without penalizing businesses that aren't necessarily generating rents from unfair competition.
All right, Lee, you want to take that first?
Yeah, so Daron mentioned a number of, I think, really good programs, including expanding the earned income tax credit. That is, I think, a great way of enhancing worker paychecks at the low end. I like the idea of a government jobs program to be integrated with unemployment insurance. When we think about the labor market, government intervenes substantially with unemployment insurance, and economists generally agree that's a good idea because we want workers to find the right job for their skill set, and that can take some time. But on the other hand, if there are folks that are having a hard time finding jobs, month after month, I think for a variety of reasons, economists like to talk about externalities a lot. I think there are positive externalities for people getting job experience early in life. The more we can do to create jobs, such as a government jobs program where people do things within their community, a lot of self-esteem comes with people having a job. A lot of confidence comes with people having a job. There's enormous learning by doing at young ages with understanding what one needs to do to function within the business community, what social and cultural mores you need to learn. So in addition to what Daron mentioned, I would talk about a government jobs program. I would also think about looking more broadly at business regulatory issues. In my state of California, we have some, it goes beyond the scope of what we can talk about today, but in my state of California, there are just some nutty business regulations. And business regulations is a cost of business. You reduce business costs, you increase the demand for workers, you increase the wages they're willing to pay. So I would look at government jobs programs and business regulatory policies.
Daron, you have a quick thought on that?
Sure, yeah, I would like to talk about that because I think it actually brings a very important set of issues. First of all, I agree with Lee about the government job programs, which should be another element in the portfolio we should consider. But the way that I think about the labor market, again, in a labor market with rents, employers have various different strategies. In my work, going back 2 decades now, I've called these good jobs and bad job strategies. The bad job strategy is you pay low wages, you don't invest in the workers, and that's profitable. In the good job strategy, you invest more in the worker, you pay higher wages. You may be forced to bargain to higher wages. Workers may have greater bargaining power. And if that increases worker productivity because of the investments and the training, that can be equally productive. And minimum wages have a particularly important role in such an environment because the market economy may oversupply bad jobs, and that's why I was linking the overall problems of the labor market. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because, Naftali, earned income tax credit is great, but it also implicitly subsidizes bad jobs. Because if the government is subsidizing low earners, that makes the deal between me and Lee, where Lee pays me very little, invests very little in me, a particularly good deal. So in a model like this, if you were to ask what is the optimal policy, even without caring about distribution, would be to couple earned income tax credit with minimum wages. So that's why I think earned income tax credit is not a substitute, but it's a complement to minimum wages. Thank you for raising that.
Thank you. And next question, I wanted to ask Chris Gibson to please give us a question.
Hey, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the discussion. We talked a lot about the $15 per hour minimum wage, but Daron then mentioned the two-tier society, and Lee mentioned like total overall compensation. So I was just wondering, instead of focusing on a specific dollar per hour floor, can you comment on the idea of having a maximum ratio of a company's highest and lowest compensation as a regulation?
Daron, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Chris. I think that would be a great outcome, but I'm not sure whether government policy regulating that would be very feasible and might be too intrusive. As you can guess, I am quite open to government regulation because I think there are failures in the labor market and in some other markets, including in innovation technology and some other investments. But I'm not very positive about very micromanagement. I think social norms and other sort of indirect inducements for companies to treat their workers more as stakeholders would be fantastic because it would push more in that good jobs direction that I mentioned. And again, my recent work finds that a lot of companies have gone much more towards cutting wages while at the same time increasing compensation for managers over the last 30 years in the US, as well as some European countries, by the way. This is not just a US phenomenon. But I don't know that governments directly regulating that would be as effective. The way that it happens in Scandinavia, for example, is that works through union bargaining, but that's not an easy model for the US to emulate at the moment because union-employer relations are much more fraught with conflictual, adversarial, and distrust issues in the United States, so that the more corporatist employers and unions working together model of Scandinavian or Nordic countries is not going to work in the US. So I think we should think about options, but it shouldn't be a very heavy-handed regulation, in my opinion.
What do you think, Lee?
Well, at the end of the day, what we know is that businesses minimize costs. I mean, they're in business to make money, and what we're seeing in California are suggested policies like that. So, for example, San Francisco recently passed what is known as it's called the excessive pay CEO tax, where tax is levied if the distance between the CEO salary and the lowest paid worker gets above a certain level. And so what that's doing is that businesses are moving to places where costs are lower. Last December, Hewlett-Packard, Oracle, and Tesla all announced in the same week that they were picking up and moving from California and all going to Austin, Texas, because just the cost of doing business in Texas is much less than California, despite the fact these are all high-tech companies and Silicon Valley remains the leading place to be. It just didn't make business sense for them to do that. So, regulation is a funny thing. People running businesses are really smart people, and it's hard to think of all the things they might do when they confront various types of mandates. And I would say 9 times out of 10, government doesn't think of all of what those might be. And what happens is that what might be a nicely intended idea ends up being one that ends up being quite negative.
Thanks. And I just want to ask John Ming to step in with his question.
Yeah, thank you. First off, thank you both for kind of taking the time to discuss. For me, I understand that one objective of the minimum wage is to kind of provide financial support to individuals on the lower end of the compensation distribution, and I'm all for that. But with the minimum wage, I think it seems that a lot of the burden rests on small businesses. And my question is, wouldn't it be more appropriate for the government to bear this burden through the form of subsidies as a supplement to their existing income? Just because small businesses are already constrained on the resources and have to compete with large multinationals, and just be interested to hear your perspectives on why maybe a minimum wage is preferable to subsidies.
What do you think, Daron?
Well, again, I think my view for that would be related to the answer that I gave in response to Naftali's question. If there is this bad job path that is not effective, not optimal socially, then the minimum wage actually is not just a burden, it's also a corrective. And Lee put it as the business of business is cost reduction. Well, I would take a little bit of issue with that. Just focusing too much on cost reduction may not be optimal, because you can invest in your workers, you can invest in better technology to increase the productivity of your workers, or in the training, or build better long-term relations with your workers. And those are part of the good job strategies. And many of the companies in the US that are very profitable are still paying wages that are very close to the minimum wage or below the minimum wage. McDonald's, Burger King, Walmart. Those are employers that are rich enough to go for the good job strategy, but don't quite do that. And the minimum wage would play a corrective role. And again, that's going back to Naftali's question, a combination of earned income tax credit and minimum wages would be preferable in this regard, because earned income tax credit would boost earnings for low earners, but minimum wages would still have the encouragement role of protecting the earnings of low wage workers in a rentful labor market.
What do you think about the subsidies, Lee?
Small businesses often have lower margins. They tend to be new businesses. They tend to have failure rates in which half of them are gone within the first 4 years of their formation. So there's a little bit of a playing with fire aspect to having a high minimum wage and forcing it on small businesses. And for that reason, almost all at the state level, minimum wages tend to be two-tiered, one for small businesses and one for larger businesses. The challenge with that is that there's an incentive. There's a lot of bunching right at the cutoff level for the number of workers. At a bigger picture, in terms of John's question, when we first started talking, I really wanted to focus on individuals because I hate the idea of government getting in the way of people creating mutually advantageous trades. And I think one thing that makes the U.S. economy what it has been over the years is because there's a lot of economic freedom. And interestingly enough, the literature that that Daron has been citing, which is called the new minimum wage literature, that started about 30 years ago with a paper by David Card and Alan Kruger. At that time, were both at Princeton. And was aimed at fast food industries. And what's interesting is that over that 30-year period, there's probably been I shouldn't say no industry, but that industry's had just an enormous amount of mechanization over time, to the point where the president of the San Francisco Restaurant Association is predicting that there won't be a worker left in a fast food restaurant in San Francisco within 7 years because they find it profitable to replace them with robots and other forms of capital. And the history of technical change, which Daron has been a major contributor to, has really been replacing neuromuscular activities of humans doing repetitive tasks with machines doing those. And I see no reason to think that that's not going to continue. And if we artificially drive up costs, and here Daron, I have a distinction. I think about minimum wages depressing and damaging the opportunities that people might have. He sees it as a corrective action. From my standpoint, driving up costs further is just going to increase the rate of mechanization. And that's why during my opening remarks, I really focus on education, because we should be aiming for the minimum wage to be a footnote, hopefully 10 years from now, such that workers have the adequate level of human capital to be competitive for a variety of jobs. And among our adult workers in the OECD, which is a group of 35 developed economies, US, Canada, most of Western Europe, US workers between the ages of 16 and 65 come in dead last. They come in dead last in terms of the ability to apply and interpret mathematical knowledge. And I'm not talking about anything particularly difficult. Being able to say, take a number with 2 decimal points and divide it by 2. US workers are dead last in the OECD. In my state of California, only 10% of Black kids are at grade level proficiency or above. Only 10%, only 15% of Hispanic kids are at that level. So if we can make those, so I think that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. If we make progress on that, then the minimum wage becomes much less of a relevant issue, because workers will have human capital, they'll have skills, they'll have bigger markets, there'll be more competition for them. So I think that I'd love, so when Eric asked me as president, what would you say? And I said, okay, $10 an hour, but I hope that we can work on our education industry such that we don't need to keep talking about this 10 years from now.
I'd like to call on Randy Zhu for the next question.
Oh, hi. So my question is, has there been a lot of research done on global versus domestic effects of the minimum wage, in that there must be some businesses that are competing in a global marketplace, either they're exporting or they're subject to import competition, and some businesses like a nail salon that are purely domestic. So wanted to understand what the considerations there were if if the minimum wage was even much of a factor in the businesses that were globally competitive, Lee seemed to indicate that it's more like service, domestic focused sectors. And if it is, if it does impact globally competitive sectors, then the question is how much should we consider that? And if it doesn't, I guess then the question is, then why should we be worried? Because it seems like, if anything, like Lee was saying, well, some of these businesses have low margins, but the Fed's been saying that we could use higher inflation anyways. And it seems like a small business that can't compete against a big business, that's a bigger issue than just the minimum wage. So I that's a long-winded question, but I guess it starts with the global versus domestic angle.
Well, Lee is completely right. It's almost no exporting firm pays the minimum wage in the U.S. right now. So it is completely a service sector issue.
Do you agree, Lee?
Yeah. 60% are in service sectors. The second would be retail apparel. And then the third would be jobs such as home healthcare aides, nursing home aides. And there, I think Daron and I would agree that we really need to have a lot of protection and probably a lot of regulation in those industries, given what's at stake. But interestingly, as I was preparing for this, I came across a document from about 5 years ago that were the 10 largest companies that were paying low wages. One was Sears, which is now out of business. Another was Macy's, which is closing a lot of stores. Another was TJ Maxx, another apparel company, closing a lot of stores. Another was the holding company for Taco Bell and other fast food restaurants who is struggling. So again, where Daron and I think we differ a little bit is, just how realistic will it be that we can provide a federal level minimum wage, and then we're not going to have the kind of job loss that I worry about. I know Daron worries about job loss, but I think from his perspective, he doesn't. And not taking issue with that is his position is completely intellectually defensible. So again, it just really boils down to differences that we see in terms of what's feasible and what's incentivized. And in terms of Randy's question, there definitely is a lot of offshoring of economic activity if business can save money. And this goes anywhere from production in low cost countries such as Vietnam, China 20 years ago, all the way up to radiologists in India who now look at MRIs and CT scans, and they do it at a lower cost than American radiologists. So it hits across the entire wage spectrum.
So if I could ask one thing to that, since we're almost out of time, and one important point which Lee's comment brings up, absolutely, I think, competitive businesses that have to pay wage pressure may be in trouble. But if you look at European economies, they export much more given the European Union structure and the proximity. And minimum wages in many of these economies, France, the UK included, are in the vicinity in terms of the relative to the median of the US $15 an hour. And the evidence from those economies too doesn't find a huge negative employment effects. But that's just another bucket that we didn't get to talk about, the international comparison, but I wanted to add that.
Right. And I wanted to give Philip Spitta briefly, because we're right up against the time, if you would like to ask the last question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen. My question was, how is the minimum wage that prices workers out of the labor market going to make up for the lack of education that I think you both agree on? Aren't there other ways of redistribution or policy that would better address this problem?
Well, again, if I could say, I agree with Lee that U.S. education system is a problem, but I do not agree that the only thing we need to do in the U.S. is improve education. there are going to be a lot of non-college workers. Many of the service sectors and health jobs are not going to require college skills. Those jobs used to pay higher, more competitive wages, and more workers have been shifted into them because a lot of the automation that Lee mentioned has led to the disappearance of more middle-class jobs and blue-collar clerical back office functions. So I think if we're going to have anything resembling a little bit more shared prosperity, we need to make non-college work pay as well. It's not just sending more people to college.
And Lee, a last word?
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. And when I talk about U.S. workers being just absolutely at the bottom of the ability to use math in just the simplest way, this is not at college level math. This is math that's roughly 8th or 9th or even 7th grade level. And so to get to the question about are there alternatives, I would say, yeah, we should just substantially expand community college access and just teach remedial mathematics. And not for the sake of learning algebra, but we know that having an adequate math aptitude makes a person be able to think analytically, to think logically, to have a linear progression of thought, to be somewhat of a problem solver, to be competitive for managerial type jobs, which they may not now, to have remedial training and communication skills. I think this could be game changers and not run the risk of intervening and reducing economic freedom and possibly damaging matches between people who want to work and people who want to hire them.
Well, we'll have to end it there as we're at our time, but thank you both so much for your insight. I learned a lot. I hope everyone on our call here learned a lot, and hope you can join the next event real soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's been great talking with you on these topics, Lee, and thanks, Kate, for organizing it.